Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, sahavidyan karavavahai, tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Om. Good. Welcome to you all. Welcome also to our many students watching these classes online. It's wonderful to return to our study of Shankara's Upadesha Sahasri. We took a summer holiday, and I actually have mixed feelings about having taken that summer holiday. I missed the classes, and I have a feeling this coming summer, no holiday. I think we just keep going. And it's quite a long text. The chapters we've seen so far have been quite short, but we have some, we're maybe a third of the way through the text at this point, so much more remains to follow. And it's very, very profound material. I love this text. I think it's really helpful. I'll give a little more introduction in just a moment. Some of you know that we had to cancel yesterday's class at the last moment, and it was due to some minor health problems. I'm still not doing that great today, but I think I can teach okay. I always prefer to teach, so canceling a class is always last resort, so to speak. But the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is this. Those of you who are coming locally, be sure to check your email each morning before you come. And if you're not, obviously, if you're not signed up for our program announcement emails, sign up for those, because that's how we'll let you know. So if classes are canceled due to health issues, or winter is coming, we'll have class cancellations due to weather as well. So please do check your email before coming here for class in the morning. Also, I'll just remind you that the classes are available on, everything we do here is recorded, available on the YouTube channel. Also, the slides we're using are also available on the YouTube, on our website. So sometimes it's nice to take notes on those. So all of that is available. Okay. So we resume today with chapter 14, and as you heard me mention before, each of these chapters are completely independent. They're like a collection of little independent books, so to speak, small books. So there's no continuity from one chapter to another, which is good if you're coming for the first time or watching for the first time. That's very helpful. But one thing you'll notice is that pretty much the main topic of each chapter, in one way or the other, is the nature of sat-chit-ananda atma. Now, Vedanta texts can get into many other topics. For example, Ishvara, creation of the world, psychological issues, karma yoga, so much meditation. But this text continues to address the confusion we have about one's true nature as pure consciousness. And it's as though this topic is approached from different angles, different perspectives. I think that's extremely useful. And one reason it's extremely useful is that in this kind of teaching, you have an opportunity to make personal discoveries that culminate in so much inner transformation in general, but inner freedom, in the sense that you lose this tension with regard to life. attention that's resulting from the assumption, and we've had this discussion before in this class, the assumption that everything that happens affects you. Whatever happens at work affects you. Whatever happens at home affects you. Whatever happens while you're driving your car affects you. Whatever is happening in your mind affects you. Your mood, happiness, sadness, everything affects you. And these teachings are powerful enough to make you recognize the fact that nothing affects you. Of course, the you we're talking about is your true essential nature as pure consciousness. So that's what we're going to see today and in the coming chapters. This chapter, the 14th chapter, is called Swapna Smriti Prakaranam. Prakaranam just means chapter. Swapna, as many of you know, dream, smriti, memory. Dream and memory. And the reason, sure enough, many of the chapter titles, by the way, Shankaracharya didn't give these chapter titles. Mostly they're drawn from the first verse. And guess what the first two words of the first verse are? Swapna and Smriti. But here it's also very significant because Swapna and Smriti, this is actually from the commentator's introduction. He gives a short but very helpful introduction to each chapter, showing the central point of the chapter and why it's important. And he makes a very, very important observation. And the observation is this. I have to come back to Swapna and Smriti in a moment. The observation the commentator makes with this: the only thing in life you experience directly is the contents of your own mind. Everything else, the world around you, is experienced only indirectly by means of your senses. So the terms he uses is paroksha and aparoksha. Paroksha means remote, distant. Distant in the sense that, for example, you're observing me right now, so there's physical distance involved. Not only is there physical distance involved, but there's this whole complicated mechanism of sight intervening between my presence here on the chair and your experience. You've heard me give this example before. Light bounces off my body, reaches your eyeballs. You have these nice lenses on the front of your eyeballs that collect that light and focus an image on the back of your retina inverted. So right now, on the back of your eyeballs are two 1/4-inch tall, upside down Swami Taratmanandas. Correct? That's the reality. And then the amazing thing the brain does is it converts those two 1/4-inch upside down Swami Taratmanandas projected on the back of your eyeballs. It's almost a miracle how that's converted into an image, and a 3-dimensional image. Think about all the camera and video technology that we use today is almost all 2-dimensional. The image you get from your eyes is 3-dimensional. When you move your head, you see the foreground and background moving differently. That is depth perception, which you have because of the complicated term they call it is stereoscopic vision. You got two eyeballs and they're a couple of inches apart, and because of that, your brain can interpret depth. The point I'm making is this whole complicated process of sight intervenes, so to speak, between my presence out here sitting on the chair and your experience. So definitely your experience of me sitting on the chair is paroksha, it is remote, as opposed to your experience of me sitting on the chair in your mind. There is a ch14 sitting on a chair in your mind. That image that has been recreated, reconstituted, as it were, by the power of your brain, that is in your mind, that is seen directly. Now, the significance of that is going to be brought out in this chapter. Yeah, here's an interesting observation. We generally have, in common conventional thought, we assume that whatever is out here is real, and whatever comes in our minds, it's all this strange stuff coming and going, we actually attribute less reality to what's in our minds and more reality than to what's outside. Isn't that true? That's common conventional thinking, and it's wrong. Ulta, as many of you would say, because what you see outside is so distant, and not just distant, but subject to misperceptions. If you're wearing glasses and you take off your glasses, suddenly Swami Taratmananda gets fuzzy. I didn't get fuzzy. But it shows that in the complex mechanisms through which we perceive the world around us, there are many opportunities for misperception. And we don't consider that. The example you've also heard me given is we just assume everything outside is absolutely real. That's what you experience. Here's another case of misperception. The table is made of atoms, 99.999% empty space. My hand is made of the same kind of atoms, empty space. Yet you feel solidity for very complex reasons. I'll spare you. Some of you may remember my story about electrons repelling each other. We'll skip that part for today. But the point is, perceptions mislead, which means your concept of the world around you is a fiction. First of all, it truly is a fiction of your mind. It's reconstituted and put in your mind. And then there are so many of these so-called misperceptions that take place. The world outside is not what it seems. But one thing you know is what happens in your mind. The computer people use the term, what you see is what you get. Whatever occurs in your mind is known to you directly without any intervening process. We're going to talk about that in the very first verse. And just to we'll finish up this introduction with the topic, swapna and smriti. In swapna, in dream, you perceive objects. Now, definitely the dream world is not as real as this world. That's absolutely true. But when you see a tree in your dream, is that tree paroksha, indirectly known, or aparoksha, directly known? The tree you see in a dream is directly known, correct? It's in your mind. There's no intervening process or mechanism through which you know the tree that exists during the dream, as opposed to the tree you see outside through the window. That tree has a complicated intervening mechanism taking place. The tree in your dream is actually known more directly than the tree outside the window. Isn't that contrary to conventional wisdom? But it's absolutely true. And Shankara is going to use that point to show you a huge consequence. We'll see in the second verse. I think we'll get there. That's true for swapna, dream, also memory. If you remember a tree and envision that tree in your mind, a tree that you remember, is the remembered tree paroksha, distant, or aparoksha, immediately known? Again, it's counterintuitive. We attribute so little reality to what we experience in dreams and memories, but it's counterintuitive because what you experience in dreams and memories is, in a way, not in a way, they are more immediately experienced than the world outside, which is definitely counterintuitive. So we'll go into the first verse. We'll see Shankara begin to make this comparison between paroksha, that which is seen indirectly, and aparoksha, that which is seen directly. And we'll see that. We'll start with this. Oops. Here we go, with the first verse. Swapna smrityor ghata derhi, swapna smrityor ghata derhi, rupa bhasa pradrishyate, rupa bhasa pradrishyate, puranunam tarakara, puranunam tarakara, dhir drishtetyanumiyate, dhir drishtetyanumiyate. Swapna smrityoho is dual. Whatever is in your swapna, dreams, and smriti, memories. What do you experience in dreams and memories? Ghata dehe. Ghata is a typical Vedantic metaphor, pot. So whatever you experience in your dreams, like pots, etc., he says, those are rupa abhasaha. They are the abhasa, the appearance of forms. And appearance of form because what you perceive in your mind is the form. The form of the pot truly comes into your mind in a dream and in a memory and even in the waking state, as we'll say in the second half. By the way, does the clay come into your mind? The clay doesn't come. Only the rupa, the form, comes into your mind. So rupa bhasaha pradrishyate. The appearance of the form pradrishyate is seen, is perceived in your mind. In your mind, in a dream, if you see a pot, or in a memory, if you see a pot, that pot appears in your mind and is seen. Seen by whom? Right? This is where Vedanta begins. Whatever happens in your mind is known to you as a conscious being. That conscious being, in this context, we can call sakshi, a awareful witness. You are the awareful witness of whatever's happening right now while you're awake, You are the awareful witness of whatever happens in your mind when you're dreaming. And if you, like in reverie, if you have a memory or an image of something in your mind, you are the awareful witness of whatever is present in your mind. And as we've discussed in other classes, you are the awareful witness of what happens in your mind when you're awake. You are the awareful witness of what happens in your mind when you're dreaming. And most importantly, you are the awareful witness of the absence of activity in your mind in deep sleep, in dreamless sleep. We've had this discussion. That's not our topic right now, and there are many, many arguments you've heard already that irrefutably establish the fact that your consciousness continues unabated, uninterrupted in deep sleep. It's not that the light bulb gets turned off. Remember, I've given this example of the light bulb in your refrigerator. You close the refrigerator door, the light bulb goes off, and that's a counterexample because what a stupid metaphor for consciousness. Consciousness is the essence of who you are. It's not like those light bulb in your refrigerator. It doesn't blink on and off. It would be silly to say that last night in deep sleep, you ceased to exist for about 3 hours. Okay. This is we've had many, many arguments for this. I don't want to go further on this topic. It's not our topic here, but just to make the point, there are plenty of solid arguments to prove without a shadow of the doubt that your consciousness continues to shine in deep sleep. You've heard me give the metaphor before. It's like standing in a dark room with your eyes wide open. In that dark room, you're not blind. You see. There's nothing to be seen. Okay, enough said. So that unblinking, unwavering consciousness is your true nature as Sakshi, as a awareful witness. As that awareful witness, you're aware of the forms that occur in your mind when you're dreaming and in reverie, when you have some memory. Not surprisingly, also whatever you see in the waking state. But Shankara makes a little different argument here. He says in the next line, Nunam, certainly, tad akaraha dhihi. Dhihi is a form of the word buddhi, intellect. But here, it more specifically refers to thoughts that occur in your mind. And dhihi, thoughts that occur in your mind, tadakaraha, in those forms. In the forms of what? In the form of the pot, etc. So let me give you the sense of the verse, and it's a little, the language is a little convoluted. He says, Nunam, certainly, anumiyate, it can be inferred that whatever you saw, the forms that you saw during dream and reverie, the forms that you saw, pura, were previously drishta, or you have to break apart the words, drishta iti. That's the two words are run together here. The forms that you perceive in dream and memory, pura drishta, were previously seen as dhihi, as thoughts, tarakara, in the form of those pots, etc. What's being said here is actually pretty simple. I know the language sounds complicated, but whatever you see in a dream or remember is based on what you've experienced before, right? Whatever you experience in the waking state goes into your mind, goes into your memory, and then it bubbles up in various ways. So the point here is the forms that you experience in dream and memory, those forms were experienced before in the waking state. He says, nunam anumiyate. This can certainly be inferred that you're thinking, wait a minute, I experienced lots of things in my dreams that I've never seen before. For example, you experience how about a dog with 3 heads? Have you ever in the real world seen a dog with 3 heads? No, but you can see one in a dream. And you say, how does that happen? Well, wait a minute. You've seen dogs, you've seen heads. Your mind is capable of a little creativity here. So it just adds some extra heads. It's not creating anything new. You've experienced dogs, you've experienced heads. The mind just combines them in different ways. And I think that's an accurate way to describe our dreams. In fact, it's like if you take all your worldly experiences and put them into this, you call it mixie, this blender, and whatever comes out, that's a dream. It is just, dreams are something amazing. Anyway, it's all mixed up is the point I'm making here. Mixed up, but a product of what you've experienced before in the waking state. So whatever we'll see the verse again, I'll paraphrase, and then we'll start looking at what are the consequences, what is the significance of these teachings. So he says that whatever you see in your dreams, or whatever you remember or in reverie, all of these things have been experienced before in the form of thoughts in the waking state, thoughts in your mind. Notice he doesn't say that if you see, there's a little subtle point. It's not a subtle point, it's the main point, but a little easy to overlook. If you see a pot in a dream, it's not because of the real pot outside in the world. If you see a pot in a dream, it's because of the mental pot you experienced sometime before when you were awake. That's the point he's making. He wants to show the equivalence of mental objects when you're awake, mental objects when you're dreaming or in memory are different than worldly objects. That's the point he's bringing out here. Now, before we move ahead, there's an important topic that we've actually sidestepped in some of our previous classes on this text. Questions about how we experience the contents of our minds. This is a surprisingly complicated, it is. It's a surprisingly complicated topic. How does that take place? And a form arises in your mind and it's experienced. A thought arises in your mind and experienced. An emotion arises in your mind and is experienced. First of all, no one can deny that experience. We all experience images and forms in our mind. We all experience our thoughts. We all experience emotions. By the way, there are some philosophers who say you don't really experience. And I find this one of the These are philosophers arguing for a materialistic worldview that denies the existence of consciousness at all. And they try to explain away experience itself. Talk about counterintuitive. Why would a philosopher argue that you don't really have any experience? What a silly argument. Believe it or not, there are some modern philosophers studying this trying to understand the nature of consciousness. There are some philosophers who actually argue against conscious experience. I'm just surprised by that. Anyway, that's not our topic here. No one can deny that we experience the contents of our mind. Now the question becomes, how does that happen? And that's a question, I said, is much more complicated than it seems. And let me give you an idea of the complication from the standpoint of Advaita. Science has its own complexity. And the problem in science, which is equally complex, is how does your physical brain get involved in non-physical conscious experience? Let's reflect on that just for a moment before we go into our topic. There's no question that experience has its roots in the brain. Brain is physical. Experience is non-physical. How does that work? Ask the scientists, and the honest scientists will say, we don't know. They've been working on this a lot, and they cannot explain how there's this relationship between your physical brain and non-physical experience. So science is stuck. In Vedanta, I won't say Vedanta gets stuck, but Vedanta recognizes, the ancient rishis recognized a problem here, a difficulty here. Actually, let me give you the example I need to build this up a little bit. We've never discussed this before, so this might be a little challenging, but important. Here's the difficulty. What is the relationship between the physical brain and non-physical experience? It's inexplicable. Well, Vedanta won't use those terms, physical brain and non-physical experience, but in Vedanta we make a distinction between satyam and mithya. Satyam, that which is absolutely real, and mithya, that which is only apparently real. And satyam, that which is absolutely real, is your consciousness. Remember, it doesn't blink off. Anything that comes and goes is not absolutely real. Your consciousness doesn't come and go. Your body comes and goes. Your mind comes and goes. In deep sleep, your mind is gone. Bodies come and go. Minds come and go. Consciousness is abiding. That consciousness is real. Consciousness is satyam. But we just admitted that the mind comes and goes. So look, here we're almost looking at the same problem as science in different ways. Science will look at the problem of the relationship between the physical brain and non-physical experience. We look at it in slightly different terms. The relationship between consciousness, which is absolutely real, and mind, which is not as real. To help you appreciate that difficulty, what is the relationship between this pot in my hand and a pot you dream about at night? What is the relationship between the two pots? There's no relationship between the two pots. that which exists in the real world and that which exists in your dream world are separate. Yes, there is a memory of the form and all of that, we just discussed it, but they're not intimately related. On the other hand, there is an intimate relationship between physical brain and non-physical experience, and there's an intimate relationship between consciousness, which is satyam, and mind, which is mithya. And to help you further appreciate the significance of this, it's a little technical, I understand, but Shankaracharya, in his brilliant introduction to the Brahma Sutra Bhasha that he wrote, in the portion he calls that we call a Dhyasa Bhasha, one of the most important things that Shankaracharya has ever written, he begins with a Purva Paksha, an opposing point of view, in which he says it's utterly impossible for there to be any contact between Satyam and Mithya. He says they're completely separate. He says they're like light and dark. Like light and dark cannot coexist. Satyam and Mithya are that, they're polar opposites, we would use in English. Now, this is a philosophical perspective that challenges our ordinary experience. Because what is your experience right now? You are conscious of what's happening in your mind. So here we have some philosophers saying, oh, that's impossible. Wait a minute. Do you see my point? What you're experiencing right now, some philosophers, including the opposing point of view that Shankara invented, some philosophers say it's impossible. But here's a good example of experience overriding logic. Because no amount of reasoning can disabuse you of your experience that you know what's happening in your mind right now. So what that shows is there's some problem with the logic. And here's where we go into proper Vedanta. Anyway, that I admit what I just shared with you was a little bit technical. So if it didn't work for you, don't worry about it. This part will be much more accessible. The relationship in science between the physical brain and non-physical experience. In Vedantic terminology, the relationship between consciousness, which is real, and mind, which is less real. Mithya, satyam and mithya. Fortunately, Vedanta deals with this subject matter extremely well. We use this pot example again and again to show the relationship between clay, which in this metaphor is satyam, and pot, which in this metaphor is mithya. Really speaking, that only applies in this metaphor. So, relative to the pot can come and go, clay continues to exist. That's the metaphor. Now, so we have clay, which is metaphorically satyam. We have pot, which is not as real as the clay, so we call it mithya. Is there any relationship between clay and pot? Well, once again, what do you experience? You experience a pot made of clay. In terms of experience, they're absolutely related. They're related as content and form. There's a relationship between content and form. Now, you say, then why are these philosophers trying to say there's no relationship? And the argument is, we'll go back to my complicated argument before. There's only clay. Pot is not as real as the clay. From the standpoint of clay, there's no pot whatsoever. So notice we can use this philosophy, to dismiss the reality of pot. And if we dismiss the reality of pot, there's no relationship whatsoever between clay and pot. You see, now you're getting the logic a little bit. And we'll finish up with this logic and move ahead in just a moment. So, what we are appreciating right now is the difficulties associated with this philosophical analysis of our experience of being conscious beings, observing the contents of your mind. The point I'm trying to make is it is so common in our experience, but on analysis, it ends up being really hard to understand, just like in science. The relationship between physical brain and non-physical experience seems so obvious that there's a relationship, science is unable to explain it. And so too in Advaita Vedanta. From a strictly philosophical point of view, there is only consciousness. Problem is, that doesn't explain our experience. So we have to, as it were, come down a step. At an absolute reality, there is only consciousness. There is only Brahman. Brahman is that consciousness, the reality because of which everything exists. But at that absolute level of reality, there's no possibility of discourse. We can't talk about anything. Everything is Brahman. So how can you talk about relationship between Brahman and Brahman? It becomes meaningless. So for our discussion to proceed, we have to deal with our experience and recognizing that it's more complicated than it seems. And let me try now to give you something more concrete. We'll send you home with something more concrete. We want to explore, we may actually wait for the next class, we'll see. We want to explore, how is it that consciousness is associated with your mind? It's like the science problem. How is it that the physical brain is associated with consciousness? Our version of that question is, how is it that your consciousness is associated with your mind? It's a parallel question. Science says we don't know. Vedanta approaches it slightly differently. And here's a good metaphor. How did this pot and clay come into relationship? I've never used this before. Let's see if it works. I think it works. I've thought about this when I prepared this class. How did this clay and pot come into a state of relationship? Well, we're not exactly sure, right? Now, we can make some guesses. We can guess that maybe in India there was a potter at his wheel, and he took a lump of clay, put that clay on the wheel. used his fingers and thumb. He created the pot form, used a string, and cut the pot from the lump of clay, and then put it in the sun to dry. Do you know that for sure? You don't know that for sure. There are many other possibilities. For example, turns out this pot, I can tell by looking at it, was not made by a potter in India. It was made, I don't know where, but it was made by injecting liquid clay into a mold and then baking it. That's how this pot was made. So now, the point I'm making is, by looking at the pot, you can't really be sure of how did the clay and pot come into relationship. There are multiple ways it could have happened. Excuse me. Sorry. There are multiple ways this clay and pot could have come into relationship. It could have been by a physical potter. It could have been a mold. It could have been that there was some kind of naturally existing pot. We don't know. But there are my point is, there are multiple explanations possible for the relationship between this pot and the clay. And the point I'm leading up to is, there are in Vedanta multiple explanations for the relationship between your consciousness and thoughts. There are multiple explanations. There's not just one explanation. And to make this concrete, let's talk about the two primary ways. Maybe I'll save some details for next week. There are two primary ways that the relationship between consciousness and thoughts is explained in Vedanta. The two primary ways are this. One is your consciousness is like the sun. Like the sun reveals forms in the world, your consciousness is shining, metaphorically, revealing the contents of your mind. When the sun shines, you see the reflection of that sunlight. That's called experience. And when your consciousness shines, revealing the presence of this pot in your mind, consciousness shines on the mental pot, and the mental pot, figuratively speaking, reflects your consciousness. So we've had in prior classes very detailed discussions about reflected consciousness. Remember, I've used the example of light shining on water and being reflected by that water. When light shines on the water, the condition of the water gets imprinted on the reflection. If the sun shines on perfectly still water, you see a perfectly still reflection of that sun. If the sun shines on rippling water, the ripples of the water appear in the reflected light. We've discussed this extensively in prior classes. And I'm going to say something surprising right now. What we described in those classes is not, strictly speaking, correct. It is an explanation. It is not the only explanation. Just like I said, if this pot could have been made in India, this pot could have been made in a mold, this pot could have been somehow a naturally existing pot. I know they don't really exist, but the point I'm making is that there are multiple ways to explain the relationship between pot and clay. And now you're hearing, I think in this class for the first time, there are multiple ways to explain the relationship between your consciousness and your mind. The way we've been using so far is called Pratibimba Vada. We'll start our next class with this very topic. Pratibimba Vada is the doctrine of reflection. It is one of two main ways of describing relationship between consciousness and thoughts, and it's based on that reflection metaphor. Sun reflecting off the surface of the water, the reflected light is affected by the nature of the water. In the same way, consciousness reflected by your mind. The nature of the water affects the reflection of light. The nature of your mind affects the reflection of consciousness. And if you have a good memory, you might remember that we've defined reflected consciousness is experience. What you experience right now is the reflection of consciousness in your mind, that reflection being conditioned by the nature of your mind. So the nature of your mind right now has the image of me sitting here, and that mental condition affects the nature of consciousness. Consciousness itself has no form, just like clay itself has no form. Clay assumes a form. Consciousness assumes the form of whatever you experience due to its reflection in your mind. But you've heard this in prior classes, and the new topic for today is this. It's not the only way to explain the experience that you're having right now. There is a second manner of experience, which is Shankara is going to talk about in 2 more verses. First one, and again, we'll start our next class with this topic, so it'll become crystal clear in our next class. So we distinguish then between this explanation, called Pratibimba Vada, the doctrine of reflection, and we contrast it with Avacheda Vada, the doctrine of conditioning. And the doctrine of conditioning we have not discussed in this class. We have discussed it maybe long ago with some other texts, maybe Drisha Viveka, I'm not even sure where, but we have discussed it in prior texts, but not here in this Upadesha Sahasri. So what does it mean that there's a second way of explaining our experience, not as a reflection, but as conditioned consciousness? I'll give you a simple, short explanation. Then in our next class, we'll see these two side by side with some clarity, and then see the significance of this as Shankara brings out. The metaphor, the basic metaphor for this Avacheda Vada is wave and water. The content of every wave is water. Every wave has a different form. These different forms are superimposed on water. In the same way, your mind superimposes a form on your consciousness. Your consciousness, like the formless water, your mind has a capacity to give form to formless consciousness. Just like pot gives form to clay, something about your mind has the capacity to give form to consciousness. So just as water can appear in the form of a wave, your consciousness can take the form of Swami Atma-vichara, can take the form of a pot, it can take the form of anything you experience. Now notice, as we conclude our class, these are actually very different ways of explaining our experience. One is to say that consciousness illumines the activities of your mind, and when it illumines the activities of your mind, that consciousness shining on your mind is affected by what's in your mind, and that reflected consciousness is what you experience. How different that explanation is from right now, what you're experiencing is just consciousness with a form superimposed on it. Consciousness in the form of this experience. These are two very different explanations, and the next question we'll treat briefly. The question is, which of those explanations is correct? Does it make any difference if this pot, in terms of your experience right this moment, does it make any difference if this pot was made in India by a potter, if this pot was made by a machine being molded, or if this pot somehow was a naturally existing pot that somebody plucked off a tree, so to speak? In terms of your experience right now, does it make any difference? None whatsoever. These are alternate explanations of a current experience. And what I've just shared with you is something very few people appreciate, and that is Vedanta is, you've heard me say this actually, Vedanta doesn't tell you what is true. Vedanta is let me rephrase that. Vedanta does tell you what is true. Vedanta is not a collection of statements of fact. Vedanta is a collection of explanations to help you understand your experience. That's really accurate. Vedanta explains your experience in multiple ways for the purpose of freeing you from suffering. Generally, we interpret our experiences in such a way that we suffer. Vedanta gives you alternate ways of understanding your experience so that suffering can come to an end. And with that, our class is going to come to an end. This introduction, I feel, was a little abstract. In our next class, we'll get into something quite concrete in terms of the relationship between your mind and thoughts and the consequences of that. We'll see that in our next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayah Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavit Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. Very good. We're going to take a